My husband did not just cheat on me. He looked me dead in the eye and laughed while admitting he bought his 22-year-old mistress a luxury condo using our life savings. When I packed my 3 young children into my rusted car and drove through the freezing Seattle rain to my parents' house, begging for shelter, my father looked at his shivering grandchildren and slowly closed the front door in our faces. My brother told me there was no space. My sister called me a liability. I picked up my garbage bags of belongings, walked back to my car, and made a silent promise that would ultimately destroy their entire world. Before I tell you how I went from sleeping in a Walmart parking lot to seizing control of my family's entire financial existence, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to build an empire from the ashes of betrayal. My name is Naomi, 33 years old, and until that freezing Tuesday evening, I believed my marriage was a safe harbor. I was doing laundry when I found the folded paper tucked deep inside the inner pocket of Brendan's custom-tailored suit jacket. Brendan is my husband. He is 35 years old and a high-level strategy director at a major tech firm. We had been married for 8 years. I unfolded the thick parchment paper expecting a dry cleaning receipt or a dinner bill. Instead, I found a bank statement for an offshore account. It was not an account I recognized, and the numbers staring back at me made my blood run cold. There was a recent withdrawal of $120,000. I stood in our massive kitchen gripping the marble island to steady myself as Brendan walked through the front door. He tossed his keys onto the counter, his tie already loosened, looking like the picture of corporate success. I slid the offshore bank statement across the smooth marble surface toward him. I asked him what it was, my voice shaking. I expected him to panic. I expected him to scramble for an excuse to lie or to beg for forgiveness. Instead, Brendan picked up the paper, glanced at it, and laughed. It was a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the high ceilings of our Seattle home. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and leaned against the counter. He told me the money was gone. He had drained our joint savings account, transferring it through a series of shell accounts to hide the trail, and used it to buy a luxury condominium downtown. The condo was not an investment property for us. It was a gift for his 22-year-old intern. He looked me right in the eyes and said she actually appreciated a successful man unlike me who just sat at home draining his resources. The irony of his accusation burned my throat. I was not some helpless dependent who had never worked a day in her life. Before I became a mother, I was a top-tier financial auditor at one of the most prestigious accounting firms in the city. I was the person corporations called when millions of dollars went missing. I knew how to track every cent, how to read the hidden stories in balance sheets, and how to spot a lie buried in a tax return. I had a brilliant analytical mind, and I was on the fast track to becoming a partner. But 6 years ago, Brendan convinced me to step away from my career. He said his salary was more than enough, and that our children needed a full-time mother. I gave up my ambitions, my financial independence, and my professional identity to raise Liam, who is now 7, Noah, who is 5, and Stella, who is just 3 years old. I sacrificed my own earning power to build the foundation of our family so Brendan could climb the corporate ladder without distractions. And now he was using the wealth I helped him build to replace me with someone fresh out of college. I told him I would not let him get away with this. I told him I would hire a forensic accountant and take half of everything, including his retirement funds and the equity in our home. Brendan just smiled, that same arrogant, chilling smile. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope, tossing it onto the kitchen island right next to the offshore bank statement. They were divorce papers, fully drafted, meticulously prepared, and completely one-sided. He had been planning this ambush for months. He informed me that I was getting nothing. He reminded me of a detail I had foolishly overlooked when we got married young and wildly in love. The house we lived in had been purchased solely in his name before we were legally married. Because I had contributed to the mortgage from a joint account that was now empty, and because I had no current income, his lawyers had constructed a legal loophole to push me out with nothing. I told him he was insane if he thought I was leaving my home. But Brendan had already made his next move. He pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services. I listened in absolute horror as my husband of 8 years calmly told the police dispatcher that his estranged wife was acting erratically, refusing to leave his property, and making him feel unsafe. He was weaponizing the law against me. When he hung up, he looked at his watch. He told me the police would arrive in exactly 20 minutes to escort me off the premises. He said I had until then to pack whatever I could carry. I was entirely paralyzed by the sheer sociopathy of his actions. He was throwing the mother of his 3 children onto the street in the middle of a winter storm. I ran upstairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. I did not have suitcases readily available, so I grabbed heavy-duty black garbage bags from the kitchen pantry. I frantically shoved Liam, Noah, and Stella, clothing their favorite stuffed animals, and a few of my own basic necessities into the bags. The kids were crying, confused and terrified by my panic. I hauled the garbage bags down the stairs just as the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser illuminated our living room windows. I walked out of the only home my children had ever known, carrying our lives in trash bags, completely unaware that the worst betrayal of the night was still waiting for me at my parents' house. The drive away from Brendan's house was a blur of flashing police lights and torrential Seattle rain. I gripped the steering wheel of my 12-year-old rusted Honda so tightly my knuckles turned white. In the back seat, my 3 children were shivering and sobbing, terrified by the sudden upheaval of our entire lives. Liam held his little sister Stella tightly, trying to soothe her cries, while Noah stared out the window into the pitch-black night in absolute silence. The heater in my car had stopped working 2 winters ago, and the damp cold seeped into our bones. I had exactly $12 in my wallet and half a tank of gas, but I told myself not to panic. I had a safety net. I had my parents. I drove toward the wealthy enclave of Mercer Island, where my parents Harrison and Diane lived in a sprawling 6-bedroom estate. It was the house I grew up in, a towering monument to my father's success as the owner of a massive supply chain company. As I pulled up to the towering wrought iron gates, I punched in the keypad code. The gates swung open and I drove up the long, perfectly manicured driveway. The mansion glowed warmly against the stormy sky, a beacon of safety and wealth. I parked my battered car next to my father's pristine Mercedes, unbuckled the kids, and hurried them through the freezing downpour to the grand double front doors. I rang the doorbell frantically, shielding Stella inside my thin jacket. The heavy oak door swung open. My father Harrison stood there in a cashmere sweater, a glass of expensive red wine in his hand. He was 62 years old, obsessed with his public image, and looking at me as if I were a stranger asking for spare change. My mother Diane appeared right behind him. She was 60, draped in silk, her face tightening with immediate disapproval at the sight of our soaking wet clothes dripping rainwater onto her imported marble foyer. I gasped for breath, quickly explaining what Brendan had done. I told them about the offshore account, the 22-year-old mistress, the luxury condo, and the police escort. I begged my father to let us in just for the night, just so the children could get warm and sleep on a soft floor while I figured out my next move. Harrison did not step aside. He did not reach out to hug his freezing grandchildren. Instead, he looked nervously out into the driveway, as if afraid the neighbors might see my rusted car ruining the aesthetic of his property. He took a sip of his wine and sighed heavily, his face contorting into a mask of pure disgust. He told me I was embarrassing the family. He said those exact words with a straight face while my 3-year-old daughter shivered against my chest. Harrison looked me dead in the eye and said, "Men stray, Naomi. It is a fact of life for successful men like Brendan. You should have looked the other way. You should have kept your mouth shut and maintained your household instead of throwing a hysterical fit." I stared at him in utter disbelief. My own father was defending the man who had just stolen my life savings and thrown his grandchildren onto the street. I looked to my mother for support, but Diane just crossed her arms defensively. She told me I was being overly dramatic. She said I had clearly failed to keep my husband satisfied, and that running away into the night was a pathetic attempt to play the victim to gain sympathy. Before I could even process the psychological whiplash of their gaslighting, my older brother Mitchell sauntered into the hallway. Mitchell was 35, the undisputed golden boy of the family. He lived rent-free in the east wing of the estate. He was wearing designer loungewear, holding a pool cue, and looking immensely irritated by the disruption to his evening. I pleaded with Mitchell. I asked him to just let us use one of the 3 empty guest rooms for a few hours. Mitchell scoffed, leaning his weight on his pool cue. He told me the guest rooms were currently full of his vintage golf club collection and his new virtual reality gaming setup. He said there was simply no space for 3 noisy kids and a crying woman. My analytical brain, the auditor instinct, I could never quite turn off, suddenly screamed with the deafening hypocrisy of that exact moment. Just last year, Mitchell had blown through a massive fortune day trading volatile crypto coins and gambling on illegal sports betting sites. He had owed terrifying people a lot of money. Harrison had happily written a check for $50,000 to pay off Mitchell's gambling debts without a single second of hesitation, solely to protect his golden boy from facing consequences. My father had casually dropped 50 grand to save a degenerate gambler, yet he was currently denying his 3 freezing grandchildren a patch of heated hardwood floor to sleep on. I opened my mouth to point out this sickening double standard, but my phone vibrated in my damp pocket. I pulled it out with trembling fingers. It was a text message from my younger sister Caroline. Caroline was 30, the family princess, utterly vain and constantly competing with me for our parents' validation. She did not live at the estate, but Diane must have immediately texted her the gossip about my arrival. Caroline's message read clearly on my cracked screen. "You are being so impulsive, Naomi. You are a complete liability to this family right now. We cannot have your messy divorce ruining Dad's business reputation. Go back and apologize to Brendan before you lose everything." I looked up from the glowing screen. Harrison stepped forward, his expression hardening into absolute stone. He told me to go back to my husband, beg for forgiveness, and fix the mess I had created. He said he would not harbor a runaway wife and bring scandal to his pristine doorstep. Then my father slowly pushed the heavy oak door forward. I heard the unmistakable metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place. The porch light flicked off, plunging me and my children into total darkness. The freezing rain beat down relentlessly against my shoulders. I did not bang on the door. I did not scream. I did not drop to my knees and plead for mercy. The tears completely stopped. A terrifying, icy clarity washed over my entire body. Every ounce of familial love, every shred of daughterly devotion I had ever held for these people evaporated in an instant, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. I picked up the garbage bags. I took Liam and Noah by their hands. I carried Stella back to the rusted Honda. I strapped them into their car seats, making sure they were as warm as possible under my thin coat. I closed the car doors, blocking out the sound of the storm. I walked around to the driver's side, placed my hands on the freezing metal roof of the car, looked back at the sprawling dark mansion, and I whispered 6 words into the rain. "I will never need you again." I started the engine and drove away from the glowing estate, descending back into the freezing Seattle storm. The heater remained dead, pumping only frigid air into the cabin. I navigated through the rain-slick streets until a 24-hour Walmart emerged from the darkness. I pulled into the furthest corner of the massive parking lot, wedging the rusted Honda between a broken shopping cart corral and a towering light pole. Liam and Noah had finally fallen asleep, their small heads resting against each other. I pulled Stella into the front seat, wrapping her in my damp coat, holding her tight. The rain battered the roof of the car like a drum. I sat awake the entire night, shivering violently, watching the shadows for any sign of danger. Every time a car drove past, my heart hammered against my ribs. I did not shed a single tear. Tears were a luxury for women who had safety nets. I only had survival. When morning light finally broke, my bones ached with a deep, piercing cold. The kids woke up hungry and confused. I used 10 of my last $12 to buy a loaf of bread, some peanut butter, and 2 bottles of water from the store. We ate in the car in silence. Once fed, I drove to the outskirts, searching for the cheapest motel. I parked outside a dilapidated cinder-block building with a flickering neon vacancy sign. I approached the front desk, traded my wedding ring to the skeptical clerk for a 3-night stay, and took the rusty metal key he slid across the scratched counter. The room smelled faintly of bleach and stale cigarette smoke. The wallpaper was peeling, and the thin floral bedspreads looked decades old. I turned on the television to keep the boys occupied and tucked Stella into a lumpy bed. I locked the deadbolt, fastened the chain, and finally took a breath. We were safe, but we were entirely destitute. I sat on the edge of the second bed and pulled one of the black garbage bags toward me. I needed to take an inventory of our entire existence. I dumped the contents onto the stained carpet, sorting through damp clothes and stray toys. At the bottom of the bag, wrapped in a sweater, my hand brushed something metallic. I pulled it out. It was an old laptop. It was Brendan's previous work computer, a machine he had casually tossed into the utility closet months ago after his tech firm issued him a brand new model. In my frantic rush to pack, I must have grabbed it blindly, mistaking it for a stack of children's books. I stared at the scratched aluminum casing. A strange electric current of adrenaline rushed through my veins. For 6 years, I had suppressed my professional identity to play the role of the perfect accommodating housewife. But before that, I was a predator in the financial world. I was an auditor who tore apart corporate ledgers to find hidden truths. Brendan always thought my career was just a cute little job I did before settling down to raise his children. He severely underestimated me. He forgot that I spent my entire professional life hunting people exactly like him. I plugged the cord into a loose wall outlet and pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life. Brendan was arrogant, and arrogant men are notoriously lazy with their digital security. The login screen prompted a password. I typed in the name of his childhood dog, followed by his birth year. The screen unlocked instantly. I did not want to cry over my shattered marriage. I wanted to destroy the man who broke it. I opened the file directory and began my hunt. I was looking for the paper trail of the condo, the credit card receipts for his 22-year-old intern, the restaurant bills, the luxury gifts, the undeniable proof of his infidelity that I could use in a divorce proceeding. I navigated through his personal folders, his emails, and his downloaded bank statements. My eyes scanned rows of data, my mind shifting back into the cold rhythm of auditing. But as I dug deeper into the hard drive, the numbers stopped making sense. The withdrawal patterns did not align with a man simply funding a secret lifestyle. I noticed a hidden folder buried deep within a mundane system directory. It was encrypted. Brendan had used a basic commercial encryption software, clearly assuming no one would ever look closely enough to find it. But he was dealing with an auditor. It took me 45 minutes to bypass the encryption using a backdoor command sequence I had learned years ago. The folder decrypted and the files spilled across the screen. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. I expected to find jewelry receipts and romantic hotel bookings. Instead, I found a labyrinth of offshore routing numbers, fake vendor invoices, and untraceable wire transfers. My eyes darted across spreadsheets containing hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled through dummy corporations registered in the Cayman Islands and Delaware. I opened an invoice billed to his tech firm for software consulting services. I cross-referenced the vendor address. It was a vacant lot in Nevada. Brendan was approving massive payouts to ghost entities and routing the funds directly back into his own hidden accounts. The $120,000 he spent on his mistress was just a tiny drop in a massive dark ocean. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Brendan was not just a cheating husband exploiting a legal loophole to throw his family on the street. He was actively committing large-scale federal embezzlement against his employer. He was stealing millions. I sat back on the cheap motel bed, the blue light of the laptop illuminating my face in the dim room, and a slow, lethal smile spread across my lips. I had the power to end him. My fingers flew across the keyboard with a precision I had not utilized in 6 years. I did not waste a single second celebrating my discovery. In the high-stakes world of forensic auditing, digital evidence is only as good as its immediate preservation. Brendan could easily remotely wipe this laptop if he realized it was missing. I needed everything secured immediately before he noticed his mistake. I created a heavily encrypted cloud drive and began the meticulous process of extracting his entire digital footprint. I downloaded gigabytes of raw data. I carefully categorized every wire transfer, cataloged every falsified vendor invoice, and perfectly mapped out the offshore routing numbers. I built a comprehensive timeline that tracked exactly how Brendan systematically bled his employer dry over the past 4 years. As I organized the spreadsheets, a bitter memory surfaced. I thought about my mother, Diane. For years, she had paraded Brendan around our extended family as the gold standard of a man. She loved to praise him loudly at holiday dinners, calling him a real provider who took excellent care of her daughter and grandchildren. In the very next breath, she would look at me with thinly veiled disappointment and tell her friends how sad it was that I had wasted my potential. She saw my choice to stay home and raise my children as a failure, constantly reminding me that I was entirely dependent on my successful husband. Diane worshipped the wealth Brendan projected, completely blind to the fact that his entire empire was constructed on a foundation of felony wire fraud. She adored a thief while shaming the auditor who actually possessed the intellect to build real wealth. The irony was almost suffocating. I pushed my mother's toxic voice out of my head. I had no time for past grievances. I needed to secure my future. By the time the sun began to rise, casting a gray light through the motel curtains, I had compiled a master dossier. It was a bulletproof audit of Brendan's embezzlement. I closed the laptop, hid it under the mattress, and picked up my phone. I needed legal representation, but not just any family lawyer. I needed a shark. I needed someone who understood corporate malfeasance just as well as divorce law. I used the motel's patchy Wi-Fi to research top-tier litigation attorneys in Seattle. I found a woman named Veronica Pierce. Her firm was notorious for destroying opposing counsel in high-stakes, high-net-worth divorces. She was ruthless, incredibly expensive, and exactly what I required. I called her office the moment they opened. Her receptionist tried to brush me off, citing a massive retainer fee just for a consultation. I did not back down. I told the receptionist I did not have the retainer, but I had documented proof of a multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement scheme tied directly to community property in a pending divorce. I told her to give Veronica that exact message and that I would hold. 2 minutes later, Veronica picked up the line. I pitched my case with icy detachment. I laid out the facts without a single trace of emotion. I explained the offshore accounts, the dummy corporations, and the impending federal implications. I offered her a contingency deal. I told her she would not get a retainer, but she would get a percentage of the hidden assets once I forced Brendan to liquidate them. Veronica listened in absolute silence. When I finished my pitch, she laughed a sharp, appreciative sound. She told me to be at her office in 1 hour. I woke the children, fed them the last of the bread, and loaded them back into the rusted Honda. I drove downtown, parked blocks away to avoid expensive parking fees, and walked my kids into a towering glass skyscraper. We must have looked like a tragedy. I was wearing the same damp clothes from 2 nights ago, and my children looked exhausted. But when I sat across from Veronica in her sleek corner office, I did not act like a victim begging for salvation. I acted like a CEO negotiating a hostile takeover. I slid a USB drive across her pristine glass desk. I told her it contained enough evidence to put my husband in federal prison for a decade. I instructed her to draft an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and a fully finalized settlement agreement. I dictated the exact terms. Brendan would sign over full legal and physical custody of the children. He would transfer the deed to the Seattle house directly to me. He would also wire $500,000 into a newly established account as a silence fee. In exchange, I would sign the non-disclosure agreement, legally binding me from reporting his embezzlement to the authorities or his employer. Veronica looked at me with a mix of shock and profound respect. She warned me that extortion was a dangerous game. I corrected her immediately. I said it was not extortion. It was an aggressive asset division strategy based on undocumented marital wealth. I was simply asking for my fair share of the community property he had hidden. If he agreed, our divorce would remain a private civil matter. If he refused, he would face the IRS and the FBI. Veronica smiled. A terrifying smile opened her sleek laptop and began drafting the legal documents exactly as I commanded, without another word. I sat in that heavy leather chair watching her type my 3 children playing quietly with building blocks in the far corner of the office. I felt a fundamental shift in my own psychology taking hold. The terrified, heartbroken housewife who had begged for shelter in the freezing rain was completely dead. She had been replaced by a cold, calculating, and absolutely ruthless predator. I was no longer running blindly from the arrogant man who intentionally destroyed my family. I was methodically setting a perfect, inescapable trap, and Brendan was about to walk right into it. The first legal mediation took place exactly 48 hours later in a high-rise boardroom overlooking the Seattle skyline. I walked into the room wearing a tailored suit Veronica had loaned me from her personal office closet. My hair was pulled back into a severe knot. I sat down next to Veronica at the long mahogany table, folding my hands perfectly still in my lap. 10 minutes later, Brendan walked through the heavy glass doors. He looked completely relaxed, practically glowing with the arrogance of a man who believed he held every single advantage. He was flanked by 2 expensive corporate lawyers who wore custom suits and condescending smiles. Brendan did not even look at me. He took his seat, adjusted his silk tie, and leaned back in his leather chair, like he was preparing to watch a mildly entertaining movie. His lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Mr. Campbell, opened a thin manila folder and cleared his throat. He did not bother with pleasantries. He dove straight into the ambush. Mr. Campbell stated that my husband was willing to be generous despite my erratic behavior of fleeing the marital home in the middle of the night. He pushed a piece of paper across the table. It was their settlement offer. The terms were absolutely insulting. Brendan was offering me a pitiful $500 a month in spousal support for exactly 1 year. But that was not the worst part. Mr. Campbell clasped his hands together and looked down his nose at me. He explained that because I was currently unemployed, residing in a cheap motel, and utterly financially unstable, Brendan was demanding full legal and physical custody of Liam, Noah, and Stella. Brendan claimed he could provide a stable, luxurious environment for the children while I was effectively homeless. He was using the very destitution he had forced upon me to steal my children and avoid paying a single cent in child support. Brendan finally looked at me, a cruel, mocking smirk playing on his lips. He thought he had completely broken me. He expected me to cry, to scream, to beg for access to my babies. He expected the desperate housewife he had thrown into the freezing rain. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. I did not even look at his settlement offer. I simply turned to Veronica and gave her a slight nod. Veronica reached into her sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a massive 200-page bound document. It was thick and heavy, printed on premium paper. She placed it on the polished mahogany table and slid it firmly across the surface. It stopped exactly in front of Mr. Campbell. Brendan's lawyer scoffed audibly. He rolled his eyes, resting his hand on the thick binder. He told Veronica that presenting a list of my household contributions or grocery receipts would not change the legal reality of my financial instability. He patronizingly suggested we stop wasting everyone's time and sign the papers. I kept my eyes locked on Brendan. I told Mr. Campbell to open the binder. With an exasperated sigh, the lawyer flipped open the heavy cover. He glanced at the first page. Then he stopped breathing. He turned the page. He turned another. The smug, condescending smile melted off his face, instantly replaced by a rigid, terrifying stillness. The color completely drained from his cheeks. The binder was not a list of grocery receipts. It was a masterfully compiled, indisputable forensic audit report. The pages contained exact records of encrypted wire transfers, offshore routing numbers in the Cayman Islands, and invoices from non-existent vendor companies located in vacant lots across Nevada. I had mapped out every single fraudulent transaction, completely exposing the multi-million-dollar web of shell companies Brendan was using to bleed his employer dry. Brendan noticed his lawyer's sudden paralysis. He leaned over, frowning, and looked at the open pages. I watched the exact moment his entire world collapsed. His eyes widened in absolute horror. He saw the IP addresses, the hidden account numbers, and the dates of transfers he thought were buried under layers of impenetrable digital security. His jaw dropped, and he began to visibly shake. He looked up at me, his face pale and slick with sudden sweat. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany table. I spoke with a voice so cold it practically lowered the temperature in the room. I systematically detailed the exact federal statutes he had violated. I recited the penalties for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and tax evasion. I watched him shrink into his chair as I listed the precise amount of money he had stolen from his firm over the past 4 years. Then I delivered the final devastating blow. While bypassing his encrypted files, I had not just found the financial records, I had found medical bills and clinic appointments billed to his hidden accounts. I looked directly into his terrified, wide eyes. "The unborn child your mistress is carrying needs a father, Brendan," I said, my voice echoing loudly in the silent boardroom. "If you do not want the FBI at your door by 5 o'clock this evening, you will sign over full legal and physical custody of my 3 children. You will transfer the deed to the Seattle house into my name entirely, and you will wire $500,000 as a silence fee into my account right now." Mr. Campbell abruptly closed the binder, his hands actually trembling. As a corporate attorney, he knew instantly that this was no longer a simple family law dispute. His client was facing decades in federal prison, and their firm could be implicated if they continued to represent a man actively committing massive corporate fraud. The lawyer turned to Brendan and whispered frantically, telling him he had no choice. Brendan was hyperventilating. He looked at the settlement offer he had originally brought, the one demanding my children and leaving me destitute, and then he looked at the 200-page audit that was about to end his life. He was completely trapped, pinned down by the very woman he had called a liability just 3 days ago. Veronica slid my newly drafted settlement agreement across the table along with the ironclad non-disclosure agreement. She handed Brendan a high-quality silver pen. She reminded him that the banks closed in exactly 2 hours, and the wire transfer needed to be initiated immediately if he wanted to sleep in his own bed tonight instead of a federal holding cell. Brendan picked up the pen. His hand was shaking so violently he could barely manage his own signature. He signed over the house. He signed away his rights to my children. He authorized the immediate transfer of $500,000. He gave me absolutely everything I demanded without uttering a single word of protest. He had tried to bury me, but he had merely handed me the shovel to dig his own grave. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom clicked shut behind Brendan and his legal team. They practically fled the building, leaving behind a profound, absolute silence. I sat in the leather chair, staring at the executed documents that guaranteed my freedom. 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed on the mahogany table. It was a notification from my newly established bank account. The wire transfer had cleared. $500,000 sat securely under my name. I handed Veronica her percentage, thanked her for the borrowed suit, and walked out into the crisp Seattle afternoon. I did not look back. The first thing I did was drive back to the house Brendan had tried to steal from me. I hired a locksmith to change every deadbolt, every window latch, and the garage keypad. I watched the old locks fall into the garbage, realizing I was not just locking Brendan out. I was sealing my perimeter against the toxic bloodline I had left behind at that sprawling Mercer Island estate. Over the next few weeks, I completely disappeared from my family's radar. I blocked Harrison, Diane Mitchell, and Caroline on every platform. I changed my phone number. I deleted all my old social media accounts. I knew exactly what they were thinking. In their arrogant minds, my silence was proof of my absolute failure. They undoubtedly assumed I was living in subsidized housing, relying on government food assistance, and drowning in the consequences of my impulsive behavior. My mother, Diane, was probably hosting her lavish dinner parties, shaking her head in mock pity, while telling her friends that I was a cautionary tale of a woman who could not keep her husband happy. I let them believe every single delusion. Their ignorance was my greatest advantage. I did not need their validation. I needed focus. I sat at my kitchen island late at night, the house quiet with the sound of my 3 children sleeping safely upstairs. I opened a fresh spreadsheet. $500,000 was a formidable settlement, but it was not generational wealth. It was seed money. If I wanted to build an impenetrable fortress around my family, I needed to multiply that capital exponentially. I needed to build an empire, The next morning, I registered a private equity limited liability company. I named it Six Words Holdings, a permanent reminder of the promise I made to myself in the freezing rain. I will never need you again. I did not rent a flashy office or hire an expensive marketing team. I operated entirely from a secure server in my home office, remaining a complete ghost in the local financial sector. Using my elite background as a forensic auditor, I began hunting for distressed assets. I scoured bankruptcy filings, commercial default listings, and corporate restructuring dockets. I looked for companies that were bleeding money not because of a bad product, but because of incompetent, bloated management. My first acquisition was a mid-sized commercial logistics firm on the verge of total liquidation. The previous owner had over-leveraged the company to fund a lavish personal lifestyle, a story I found incredibly familiar. I approached the primary creditors and bought the corporate debt for pennies on the dollar. Overnight, 6 words. Holdings became the majority stakeholder. I stepped in as the anonymous managing director and completely gutted the operation. I fired the bloated executive board, renegotiated the supplier contracts, and audited their ledgers with ruthless precision. I found hundreds of thousands of dollars in wasted capital hidden in redundant administrative fees. Within 8 months, I turned a company facing imminent foreclosure into a highly profitable, streamlined logistical machine. I immediately flipped it to a larger corporate buyer, turning a fraction of my seed money into a massive 7-figure payout. I did not stop there. I funneled the profits directly into my next target. I bought a struggling chain of boutique healthcare clinics drowning in medical billing errors. My auditing expertise allowed me to identify the exact coding discrepancies, holding up millions in insurance payouts. I restructured their entire billing department, recovered the lost revenue, and sold the stabilized chain to a national healthcare conglomerate for triple my initial investment. I operated like a phantom. The business world knew Six Words Holdings as a highly aggressive, deeply analytical private equity firm that bought dying companies and turned them to gold. But nobody knew the face behind the corporate veil. I used registered agents and non-disclosure agreements to mask my identity. I attended virtual board meetings with my camera off, letting my ironclad contracts and razor-sharp financial directives speak for me. For 3 years, I repeated this process. I acquired, restructured, and flipped. My portfolio grew from commercial logistics to real estate management and eventually into corporate debt acquisition. I was moving millions of dollars across the country, building a war chest of liquid assets and high-yield investments. I secured private schools for Liam, Noah, and Stella. I hired a private tutor and surrounded my children with the absolute best resources money could buy. Yet, if you drove past my house, you would never know a multimillionaire lived inside. I kept the same unassuming exterior. I drove a reliable mid-tier SUV. I dressed in high-quality but unbranded clothing. I had no desire to flaunt my wealth because true power does not need to shout. True power operates in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. While I was meticulously constructing a financial fortress, my biological family was busy digging their own graves. They continued to live wildly beyond their means, entirely consumed by the desperate need to project an image of unlimited wealth. They had absolutely no idea that the daughter they threw into the rain was rapidly becoming one of the most powerful private equity players in the state. They had no idea that my growing empire was about to collide directly with their impending financial ruin. 3 years slipped by with the quiet efficiency of a well-balanced ledger. I was now 33 years old. My daily routine bore absolutely no resemblance to the desperate woman who had once traded her wedding ring for a cheap motel room. Liam, Noah, and Stella were enrolled in one of the most prestigious private academies in the Pacific Northwest. They wore crisp blazers, attended advanced robotics camps, and never once worried about the heat being turned off in the middle of winter. I had shielded them completely from the chaos of my past. 6 words. Holdings had evolved from a ruthless startup into a multi-million-dollar private equity juggernaut. I commanded a vast diversified portfolio of commercial real estate, corporate debt, and restructured logistics firms. My bank accounts were heavily fortified, protected by an intricate network of blind trusts and impenetrable legal structures. I had achieved absolute financial invulnerability. I operated with surgical precision from a secure penthouse office, executing massive corporate buyouts without ever showing my face to the public. My personal wealth was staggering, yet I maintained a perfectly unassuming profile. I was a ghost who controlled millions. While my empire expanded in the shadows, the glittering facade of my biological family was rapidly rotting from the inside out. Across the lake at the Mercer Island estate, the air of unquestionable superiority was thinning. My father, Harrison, had built his supply chain company during a completely different economic era. He was an absolute dinosaur who arrogantly refused to acknowledge the meteor blazing directly overhead. As the shipping industry modernized, adopting automated inventory tracking and lean logistics, Harrison stubbornly clung to his bloated, outdated management style. He firmly believed his aggressive handshake and country club connections were enough to secure multi-million-dollar contracts. He was devastatingly wrong. His primary clients began abandoning him for faster, cheaper tech-driven competitors. Pallets sat empty in his massive warehouses. His fleet of delivery trucks required constant expensive maintenance that he could no longer afford. Instead of adapting to the market or stepping down, Harrison doubled down on his own delusion. He refused to cut his exorbitant executive salary or downgrade his fleet of luxury company cars. He screamed at his subordinates, blaming them for his own strategic incompetence. To mask the bleeding balance sheets from his wealthy peers, Harrison started taking out massive, extremely high-interest commercial loans from aggressive lenders. He was literally borrowing money just to make payroll and keep the warehouse lights from being shut off. The walls were rapidly closing in, but his blinding pride absolutely forbade him from admitting defeat. He continued to host lavish catered dinners at the estate, pouring vintage wine with a steady hand, while silently drowning in millions of dollars of unmanageable corporate debt. He was a king sitting on a throne of gasoline, completely unaware of the match being struck in the dark. The financial rot extended far beyond my father's boardroom. My older brother Mitchell, the undisputed golden boy who could do no wrong, was facing a catastrophic reckoning of his own arrogant design. Mitchell had always possessed a champagne appetite on a tap-water work ethic. He craved the billionaire lifestyle he saw plastered across social media, but completely lacked the intellect, patience, or discipline to actually build it. 2 years ago, desperate for a massive, effortless windfall to fund his luxury car leases and designer wardrobes, Mitchell discovered cryptocurrency. He fell hard for a highly volatile, unregulated digital coin scheme promoted by online scammers promising guaranteed exponential returns. He needed immediate capital to buy in at the ground floor. Blinded by raw greed and supreme overconfidence, Mitchell went to a shadow lender. He quietly took out a massive second mortgage on his pristine 4-bedroom house, the very house Harrison had generously helped him secure years earlier. Mitchell dumped every single cent of that home equity into the crypto market. For exactly 3 weeks, he felt like an absolute genius. He watched the digital numbers climb on his smartphone and bragged loudly to his friends about his imminent early retirement. Then the market violently crashed. The digital coin lost 99% of its value overnight. Mitchell's entire massive investment vaporized into the digital ether in a matter of hours. He was left with absolutely nothing but a staggering high-interest mortgage payment he could not even begin to afford. His bank accounts were completely drained. For the past 5 months, Mitchell had not paid a single dime to the bank holding his mortgage. The late fees compounded aggressively. The final demands for payment quickly escalated into official foreclosure notices. Mitchell intercepted the mail every single afternoon, frantically shredding the heavy certified envelopes before our mother Diane or our sister Caroline could ever see them. He was living in a state of constant suffocating terror. He jumped every time his phone rang, terrified it was a debt collector or a bank official calling to seize his property. Yet every Sunday night he showed up at the Mercer Island estate for family dinner, wearing a designer watch he bought on a maxed-out credit card. He sat at the long mahogany dining table, swirling his bourbon, laughing loudly at Harrison's jokes, and playing the flawless role of the incredibly successful heir apparent. He smiled directly into Harrison's face, neither man realizing that the other was completely hopelessly bankrupt. They were a family of immaculate liars trapped inside a burning house, all pretending they did not smell the heavy smoke filling the rooms. They were so utterly consumed by their desperate attempts to maintain their fragile social status that they completely ignored the shifting currents of the local financial sector. They did not notice when their outstanding commercial and residential debts were bundled and sold on the secondary market. They had absolutely no idea that the apex predator controlling the private equity firm buying up their defaulted loans was the exact same woman they had locked out in the freezing rain. The only person who truly understood the depth of this impending catastrophe was Jamal. Jamal was Caroline's 32-year-old husband and a brilliant senior risk analyst. An African-American man who built his career entirely on his own intellect, he rose from a working-class neighborhood to the financial district's top floors. He initially assumed their staggering display of wealth was authentic, but his professional training made him hyper-observant. He saw the cracks long before anyone else, noticing how Harrison sweated when bills arrived at expensive steakhouses and how Diane deflected questions about their portfolios. His most immediate problem was his wife. Caroline was obsessed with maintaining the illusion of immense wealth to appease her mother. She aggressively drained Jamal's savings to fund a fake lifestyle, routinely dropping $5,000 on a single designer handbag for a family brunch. Jamal sat at his home office desk late one Tuesday night, staring at their joint bank statements in absolute disbelief. His accounts were bleeding dry. He printed the spreadsheets, walked into the master bedroom, and presented the catastrophic numbers, suggesting a strict budget to save their future. Caroline did not apologize. She completely exploded. Shattering a newly purchased crystal vase against the wall, she screamed at him with furious indignation. She called him small-minded and cheap, shrieking that she was born into high society, and he lacked the pedigree to understand real wealth. Telling him he was lucky to be married to her, she stormed out, slamming the door. Jamal stood in the glass-strewn bedroom. A cold calculation clicked into place. As a professional risk manager, his marriage had just become a massive liability. He returned to his home office, locked the door, and logged into his firm's premium financial databases. These sophisticated tools uncovered hidden corporate liabilities. If Caroline claimed her family was incredibly wealthy, Jamal decided it was time to audit his arrogant in-laws. He started with Mitchell. It took less than 5 minutes of searching public property registries to find the truth. Pulling up the deed to Mitchell's pristine 4-bedroom house, Jamal saw a recently filed notice of default highlighted in red. The bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings 3 months ago. Mitchell was entirely broke. Shaking his head in disgust, Jamal pivoted to Harrison. He accessed the commercial loan databases and searched for his father-in-law's supply chain company. The results were staggering. The screen populated with dozens of high-interest commercial loans. Harrison had leveraged every warehouse and transport truck his company owned. He carried a debt load so massive it was mathematically impossible to service with his declining revenue. Harrison was weeks away from inescapable bankruptcy. Jamal leaned back, staring at the glowing monitor. His wife's entire family was a hollow, rotting shell. They were arrogant frauds living on borrowed time, precisely the kind of toxic asset his firm trained him to avoid. He knew that associating with them any longer would inevitably drag his own spotless financial record down into their inescapable, self-inflicted ruin. Jamal did not confront Caroline with this devastating information. Confrontation required an emotional investment he no longer possessed. Instead, he quietly opened a separate secure bank account solely in his name. He began rerouting his annual bonuses and stock dividends away from Caroline's greedy reach. He started actively preparing his own exit strategy, waiting for the inevitable collapse of their fragile house of cards. 2 weeks later, the collapse began to materialize in a way Jamal never could have anticipated. He was sitting in a high-level strategy meeting at his corporate firm. His risk assessment team had been assigned to evaluate a massive aggressive debt acquisition in the local logistics sector. A highly secretive private equity firm was systematically buying up distressed commercial loans from major regional banks. Jamal opened the confidential dossier his director handed him. His eyes scanned the list of targeted commercial debts. Right at the top of the acquisition list was Harrison's failing supply chain company. The private equity firm was buying Harrison's debt for pennies on the dollar, positioning themselves to legally seize all his physical assets. Jamal flipped to the executive summary to identify the acquiring firm. The company was registered under the name Six Words Holdings. Intrigued by the aggressive takeover strategy, Jamal used his highest-level security clearance to dig past the corporate veil of the LLC. He traced the registered agent bypass the shell layers and finally uncovered the primary managing director. The name printed on the restricted federal tax document made Jamal stop breathing. It was Naomi. Jamal stared at the screen, his mind racing. He remembered Caroline constantly mocking her estranged older sister. Caroline always called Naomi a pathetic, impulsive welfare case who destroyed her own life. He pieced the massive puzzle together in a matter of seconds. Naomi was not living in poverty. She was the apex predator executing a masterfully orchestrated financial slaughter. She was buying her own father's debt to force his company into hostile foreclosure. Jamal looked closer at the acquisition files. He noticed Six Words Holdings had also recently purchased a bundled portfolio of defaulted residential mortgages. He cross-referenced the addresses. Mitchell's house was on the list. Naomi legally owned her Golden Boy Brothers property. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across Jamal's face. He understood exactly what the name Six Words Holdings meant. It was an absolute, unbreakable promise. He closed the confidential dossier and shut his laptop. As a risk analyst, his job was to identify a sinking ship and evacuate before the water breached the hull. He was not going to warn Harrison. He was not going to warn Mitchell. He was certainly not going to warn his financially abusive wife. Jamal realized a spectacular absolute reckoning was hurtling toward his toxic in-laws. He decided to stay completely silent, finalize his divorce papers, and prepare to watch Naomi burn their fake empire to the ground. He knew she planned this execution perfectly, and he was willing to sit back and let her finish the job. I sat behind the massive obsidian desk in my downtown Seattle penthouse office. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed view of the city skyline, a glittering expanse of power and commerce. Rain lashed against the reinforced glass, reminding me of that freezing night 6 years ago. But I was no longer shivering in a rusted Honda. I was insulated by bulletproof glass and impenetrable wealth. My 3 monitors glowed in the darkened room, displaying the secured financial portals of the largest commercial lenders in the Pacific Northwest. I accessed a highly restricted database reserved exclusively for top-tier institutional investors. A major regional bank was quietly offloading a massive portfolio of toxic commercial loans. They wanted to clear their books before the end of the fiscal quarter, and they were willing to sell the debt at a catastrophic loss just to stop the bleeding. I filtered the spreadsheet, sorting the distressed assets by sector liability ratio and default status. I did not have to scroll far. Sitting right at the very top of the highest risk category was a familiar corporate entity. It was my father's supply chain company. I opened the detailed financial dossier attached to Harrison corporate profile. My auditor instincts immediately dissected the numbers. It was a masterclass in executive arrogance and supreme incompetence. Harrison had secured his initial operational loans using his fleet of delivery trucks and his primary storage warehouses as collateral. When his revenue plummeted due to his refusal to modernize, he took out secondary and tertiary loans to cover the deficits. He was borrowing against depreciating assets to pay exorbitant interest rates. The specific line items were sickening. Instead of cutting costs, Harrison had continued to expense his elite country club memberships, luxury car leases, and lavish client dinners directly to the dying company. The debt-to-income ratio was beyond fatal. The bank had already issued 3 separate notices of default. Harrison had ignored every single one of them, burying his head in the sand while continuing to draw a massive unjustified CEO salary. The bank was completely done playing games with a delusional old man. They were offering his entire debt package for exactly 12 cents on the dollar. I picked up my secure phone and dialed my lead acquisition attorney. I did not ask for advice. I issued a direct command. I instructed him to initiate an immediate, unnegotiable buyout of Harrison Commercial Debt Portfolio through Six Words Holdings. I authorized the transfer of the required capital from my liquid reserves without a single second of hesitation. Within 30 minutes, the digital paperwork was executed. The massive regional bank happily dumped the toxic asset, completely unaware of the personal history between the buyer and the borrower. The electronic signatures cleared, and the legal transfer of the promissory notes was finalized. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and steepled my fingers, staring at the confirmation screen. The transaction was complete. I now legally owned every single outstanding loan my father possessed. I was his sole primary creditor. I held the absolute legal right to demand immediate repayment in full. When he inevitably failed to produce the cash, I held the supreme authority to seize his company, liquidate his warehouses, and repossess every single truck in his fleet. I had just purchased my arrogant father's entire financial lifeline for absolute pennies, and he had absolutely no idea that the daughter he threw onto the street now held his throat in a corporate vice. But I was not finished. A true predator does not leave any loose ends. I switched my focus to the second monitor, pulling up a county registry portal for residential real estate. My golden boy brother Mitchell was an entirely different kind of liability. While Harrison was failing through outdated business practices, Mitchell was failing through sheer unadulterated stupidity. He had secretly leveraged the equity in his pristine four-bedroom house to chase the digital mirage of cryptocurrency wealth. The bank had foreclosed on him months ago. The sluggish legal system and the backlog of municipal auctions had allowed him to remain on the property, desperately pretending everything was fine. That grace period ended today. The county was conducting a blind online auction to quickly offload a block of foreclosed residential properties. Mitchell House was listed in the current auction lot. Because it was a blind bid process, the current occupant had no legal right to know who was purchasing the deed until the eviction notice was formally served. I accessed my anonymous bidding portal funded by a separate holding shell connected to my primary enterprise. I reviewed the base asking price set by the bank to recover the defaulted mortgage. I did not place a minimum bid. I submitted a massive aggressive cash offer that instantly obliterated all competing investors. The auction timer ticked down to 0. The screen flashed green. The system confirmed the winning bid. I wired the funds directly to the county clerk office, securing the title transfer. It was brutally simple. I now legally owned the physical roof over my older brother's head. The very house my mother Diane had proudly helped decorate, the house they always used as proof of his superiority over me, was now completely mine. Mitchell was currently sitting in my living room, sleeping in my bedroom, and pacing across my hardwood floors, completely terrified of a faceless bank, entirely unaware that his little sister was the new landlord, about to kick him to the curb. I stood up and walked over to the towering windows looking out over the rain-slicked city. I held the strings to my family's entire existence. I owned their businesses, their homes, and their futures. They were currently sitting in their expensive clothes, drinking their vintage wine, desperately maintaining their pathetic illusions of grandeur. They thought they were untouchable elites, superior to the woman they had cruelly abandoned. Meanwhile, I held the legal authority to annihilate them with a single stroke of a pen. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I only felt a cold, calculating anticipation for the perfect moment to strike. Exactly 3 days after I authorized the buyout of his debt, a courier arrived at the glass doors of my father's failing supply chain headquarters. The messenger carried a single thick envelope made of heavy, expensive cardstock. Inside that envelope was an official notice of assignment from Six Words Holdings. The legal document stated in clear, unambiguous corporate terminology that his entire portfolio of commercial loans, lines of credit, and defaulted mortgage notes had been fully acquired by our private equity firm. Any competent financial officer would have read the enclosed statutes, recognized the aggressive liability transfer, and immediately understood it as a corporate death sentence. A debt acquisition of that scale from an anonymous holding company meant a hostile takeover was imminent. It meant the new creditor was preparing to foreclose and strip the company down to its copper wiring. But Harrison was not a competent financial officer. He was a narcissist entirely blinded by his own towering ego. When Harrison opened the envelope in his massive empty office, he did not see a foreclosure notice. His arrogant mind latched onto the words acquisition and private equity and immediately spun a spectacular delusional fantasy. He looked at the staggering dollar amount of his consolidated debt and convinced himself that an anonymous corporate conglomerate was stepping in to buy out his entire company. Because he had spent his life acting like a titan of industry, he genuinely believed a massive investor had recognized his supposed business genius and wanted to absorb his liabilities to partner with him. Instead of calling his lawyers to brace for bankruptcy, Harrison leaned back in his leather chair and laughed. He thought he had just won the corporate lottery. He thought his financial sins had just been washed away by a billionaire savior. He immediately called my mother. Diane answered her phone while browsing through a luxury boutique, desperately trying to ignore the fact that her platinum credit card had been declined twice that very week. Harrison practically shouted the news into the receiver. He told her they were about to close a multi-million-dollar buyout. He claimed a massive investment firm was clearing his ledgers and preparing to make him a senior partner in a global conglomerate. Diane did not question the logic. She did not ask to read the actual documents or demand proof of a formal merger. She simply absorbed his delusion and immediately magnified it. Her desperation to maintain their wealthy facade overrode any basic common sense. Diane told Harrison they needed to celebrate immediately. She insisted they needed to host a lavish public dinner to showcase their impending wealth to the family and quietly signal to their social circle that the rumors of their financial decline were entirely false. They chose Le Pristine, an exclusive Michelin star restaurant in downtown Seattle, where the tasting menu alone cost hundreds of dollars per person, and reservations were booked months in advance. They booked the most expensive private dining room, securing the reservation with the absolute last remaining sliver of credit on a secondary business card. They were effectively broke, yet they were throwing a feast fit for royalty to celebrate their own execution. The guest list was meticulously curated for maximum ego-stroking. They invited my golden boy brother Mitchell, who eagerly accepted, completely unaware that the very same holding company his father was celebrating also currently owned the deed to his foreclosed house. They invited my sister Caroline, who immediately began planning an outfit expensive enough to outshine everyone else. And they invited her husband Jamal, the brilliant risk analyst who already knew the brutal truth, but accepted the invitation with a quiet, knowing smile, eager to watch the impending slaughter unfold. But Diane needed one more guest. A toxic narcissist cannot truly enjoy a victory without someone to look down upon. She needed a peasant at her royal banquet. She needed me. I was sitting in my penthouse office reviewing the final foreclosure documents my legal team had drafted against Harrison when my secure personal phone vibrated on the glass desk. The screen lit up with a number I had not seen in 36 months. It was Diane. For 3 entire years, my mother had not sent a single message to ask if her daughter was safe, if her grandchildren were healthy, or if we had food to eat. She had completely erased us from her mind. But now, armed with fake wealth and a desperate need to gloat, she found the time to type out a message. I opened the text. The words were dripping with the exact same venom she had hurled at me on the night she locked me in the rain. Your father is closing a multi-million-dollar deal. We are celebrating on Friday. I will have Caroline get you a janitorial job at her boutique so you can stop living off welfare. Dress decently for once. I stared at the glowing screen. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her message was almost poetic. She genuinely believed I was a destitute woman surviving on government handouts. She thought she was doing me a favor by offering me a mop and a bucket at my younger sister's failing retail store. She wanted me to show up in cheap clothes, sit at the end of a luxury table, and watch her parade her delusional wealth. She wanted to humiliate me one last time to solidify her own manufactured superiority. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I did not feel a single trace of anger. I did not feel the familiar sting of a daughter seeking a mother's love. I felt the absolute cold detachment of a predator watching a trapped animal tie the noose around its own neck. They wanted a celebration. They wanted an audience. They wanted to toast to the anonymous conglomerate that was about to change their lives forever. I decided it was only polite to give them exactly what they asked for. I did not write a lengthy reply. I did not defend my financial status or reject her insulting job offer. I kept my response perfectly simple. I will be there. I hit send, placed the phone face down on the obsidian desk, and picked up my gold fountain pen. I signed my name at the very bottom of the corporate foreclosure order, legally sealing my father's absolute ruin. Friday was going to be an unforgettable evening. Friday arrived with the crisp chill typical of late autumn in the Pacific Northwest. I did not spend my morning at a salon. I did not purchase a glittering gown to match my mother's superficial aesthetic. I had absolutely no desire to play dress-up for a family that valued fabric over substance. Instead, I opened my walk-in closet and selected a custom-tailored charcoal gray power suit. It was an understated razor-sharp ensemble crafted from imported Italian wool. I ran my fingers over the lapel, appreciating the craftsmanship. It cost $4,000, but to the arrogant eyes of my family, it would look like a generic outfit suited for a struggling office worker. They would not recognize the immaculate stitching or perfect drape. They only respected large, gaudy designer logos. The subtlety was my armor. I paired the suit with a simple white silk blouse, classic black pumps, and my grandfather's vintage silver watch. I looked exactly like the apex predator of a corporate boardroom, completely ready for execution. At 10 in the morning, I walked into the private conference room of my legal team. The massive oak table was covered in pristine stacks of legal documents. My lead acquisition attorney, Jonathan, stood at the head of the table. He slid the first heavy leather binder toward me. It contained the finalized court-approved commercial foreclosure orders against my father's supply chain company. Every single line item of his massive debt was cataloged and legally bound to Six Words Holdings. The grace periods had officially expired. The second binder contained the immediate eviction notice for my brother Mitchell. The county had officially transferred the deed of his 4-bedroom house to my holding company. I now possessed the absolute legal right to order local sheriffs to physically remove him from the premises. The legal weight of these papers represented the culmination of 3 years of silent, agonizing patience and relentless strategy. Jonathan then handed me a thin, sealed black folder. This was the most critical piece of ammunition for the evening. It was the final unredacted report regarding Brendan and his massive federal embezzlement scheme. This was the killing blow. For months, I had been quietly feeding the encrypted offshore routing numbers to a highly placed contact within the Internal Revenue Service whistleblower office. The federal agents had finished their quiet investigation. They had fully corroborated every single spreadsheet I had decrypted from Brendan's discarded laptop. The black folder contained the indictment confirmation. Brendan was walking into a Michelin star restaurant tonight, believing he was an untouchable corporate elite. He had no idea that federal warrants had already been signed by a judge. I placed the 3 binders into my structured leather briefcase, snapped the brass locks shut, and thanked my legal team. The trap was set spring-loaded and ready to snap shut. Across the city, inside a sterile modern condominium, another meticulous preparation was taking place. Jamal stood in the center of his master bedroom, maintaining absolute silence. His wife Caroline was in the adjoining bathroom. The sound of running water and an expensive blow-dryer masked the sound of Jamal sliding a sleek travel duffel bag from the top shelf of his closet. Jamal was a man who calculated risk for a living, and he knew with absolute certainty that this marriage had reached a state of critical failure. He systematically packed his essential belongings. He folded 3 tailored suits, his passports, and his secure physical hard drives containing his independent financial assets. He moved with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a man completely devoid of hesitation. Through the cracked bathroom door, he could hear Caroline complaining on the phone to a vapid friend. She was shrieking about how annoying it was going to be to have her pathetic older sister ruining the aesthetic of their luxury celebration dinner. She bragged about the janitorial position she was going to humiliate Naomi with. Jamal listened to her toxic laughter, and he did not feel a single ounce of anger. He only felt profound, overwhelming relief that he was permanently severing himself from her deeply delusional existence. He zipped the duffel bag shut and quietly slid it under the bed, perfectly out of sight. He would collect it the moment the dinner imploded. Jamal then walked over to his mahogany office desk. He unlocked the bottom drawer and pulled out a crisp manila envelope. Inside were fully executed, uncontested divorce papers. The paperwork was immaculate. He had spent the last 3 weeks quietly liquidating joint assets, where legally permissible, redirecting his massive corporate bonuses into his private accounts, and securing a luxury apartment across the city. He had legally isolated himself from the impending blast radius of the entire family. Jamal slid the thick envelope into his designer leather briefcase and snapped it shut. He checked his gold watch. The reservation at Le Pristine was fast approaching. Jamal knew exactly what Naomi was capable of. He had seen the aggressive corporate filings of Six Words Holdings. He had connected the dots, tracing the massive debt acquisition right back to his estranged sister-in-law. He knew that Harrison's arrogant celebration dinner was actually a brilliantly orchestrated execution. Jamal had no intention of warning Harrison Mitchell or Caroline. They had treated him as an accessory to their fake wealth for years, dismissing his brilliant financial mind because he refused to blindly worship their toxic family dynamics. Tonight he was not going as a supportive husband or loyal son-in-law. He was attending simply to secure a front-row seat to the absolute destruction of their fake empire. It was over. He picked up his briefcase, adjusted his perfectly tailored tie, and walked out to wait for his soon-to-be ex-wife. Le Pristine was a temple of culinary excess located in the heart of downtown Seattle. The restaurant was notoriously exclusive catering only to the elite who could afford to drop thousands of dollars on a Tuesday night. I stepped through the heavy glass doors, my structured leather briefcase gripped firmly in my hand. The maitre d' immediately guided me through the dimly lit main dining room toward the VIP section. I walked with the measured, steady pace of a woman entirely in control of her environment. The private dining room was situated at the very back, shielded by heavy velvet curtains. I pushed the fabric aside and stepped into the lion den. My family was already seated around a massive circular table draped in pristine white linen. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the expensive silverware and imported wine glasses. My father, Harrison, sat at the head of the table nursing a glass of scotch with an expression of supreme arrogance. My mother, Diane, sat to his right, dripping in diamond jewelry she could no longer afford. Mitchell, my golden boy brother, was furiously typing on his phone, desperately trying to ignore the reality of his own bankruptcy. Caroline sat next to him wearing a blindingly flashy sequined gown that screamed of financial insecurity. Beside her sat Jamal, his designer briefcase resting quietly against the leg of his chair. The moment I walked into the room, the conversation abruptly died. 5 pairs of eyes locked onto me. I did not flinch. I walked to the only empty chair remaining at the far end of the table and sat down, placing my briefcase directly by my feet. Diane looked me up and down, her lips curling into a familiar sneer of absolute disgust. She let out a sharp, condescending sigh. She told me it was a miracle I actually showed up, but she expected me to at least make an effort with my appearance. Before I could even respond, Caroline leaned across the table, inspecting my charcoal gray power suit with a theatrical look of pity. Caroline laughed loudly, an abrasive sound that pierced the quiet elegance of the room. She asked if I had found my outfit at a local thrift store discount rack. She smoothed the fabric of her own gaudy dress and told me that Le Pristine had a strict dress code. She said she was embarrassed to be seen sitting next to someone who looked like a struggling administrative assistant. She offered to lend me some of her old clothes next time so I would not humiliate the family in public. I looked at Caroline's dress. I knew exactly how much it cost, because I knew exactly how much debt she was racking up on Jamal's credit cards. My custom-tailored Italian wool suit cost more than her entire wardrobe combined, but I did not correct her. I did not defend myself. I simply offered her a cold, empty smile and smoothed my napkin over my lap. Harrison cleared his throat loudly, demanding the attention of the table. He announced that before we ordered, he had a special surprise to share. He said tonight was about celebrating massive success, securing the family legacy, and looking toward a highly profitable future. He gestured toward the velvet curtains at the entrance of the room. The curtains parted and my blood ran absolutely ice cold. Walking into the private dining room wearing a smug, self-satisfied grin was Brendan, my ex-husband. The man who had drained our life savings cheated on me with a 22-year-old intern and forced his 3 children into the freezing rain 6 years ago was casually strolling into my family dinner. Brendan looked exactly the same, arrogant, overly groomed, and projecting an aura of completely fabricated wealth. He walked straight to the table and took a seat that had been secretly reserved for him right next to my father. I stared at Harrison, my analytical mind momentarily stunned by the sheer, unadulterated disrespect of this ambush. Harrison did not look ashamed. He looked incredibly proud of himself. He raised his glass of scotch and smirked directly at me. Harrison announced that Brendan was a highly successful partner to his supply chain firm now. He claimed Brendan had been instrumental in helping him secure the multi-million-dollar buyout they were celebrating tonight. Harrison looked down his nose at me with a gaze full of absolute contempt. He told me I needed to learn forgiveness. He said Brendan was a good man who made a single mistake years ago, and it was time for me to stop playing the bitter victim. Harrison leaned forward and issued a stern warning. He told me not to cause a scene, to act like an adult, and to be grateful that Brendan was willing to sit at the same table as the woman who had extorted him during their divorce. Brendan adjusted his expensive silk cuffs and offered me a patronizing nod. He told me it was good to see me. He said he hoped I had finally found some stability in my life rather than holding on to the anger of the past. He was playing the role of the magnanimous, successful executive, completely unaware that the heavy leather briefcase sitting by my feet contained his unredacted federal indictment. He had absolutely no idea that the IRS whistleblower division had already frozen his assets earlier that afternoon. The sheer audacity of the entire room was staggering. I was sitting at a table with a father facing hostile foreclosure, a brother whose house I legally owned, a sister whose husband was about to serve her with divorce papers, and an ex-husband who was hours away from being arrested by federal agents. And all of them were currently lecturing me about financial stability and maturity. I caught Jamal's eye from across the table. Jamal did not say a word, but he slowly raised his water glass toward me in a silent, respectful toast. He knew. He was the only person in the room who understood that I was not the prey. I was the executioner. A waiter approached the table pouring expensive vintage wine for my parents and Brendan. When he reached me, I politely declined the alcohol and simply ordered a glass of sparkling water with a twist of lemon. I took a slow, deliberate sip. I leaned back in my chair and let them talk. I let them dig their graves deeper with every single arrogant insult. Mitchell began loudly bragging about how his investment portfolio was about to explode completely, ignoring the fact that his bank accounts were entirely drained. Diane leaned over and told me to pay close attention to Brendan, suggesting I might learn a thing or two about how to actually build a successful career. Harrison boasted about the anonymous conglomerate that was begging to buy him out proudly, claiming his business acumen had secured the family's future for generations to come. I sat in perfect silence, listening to the symphony of their delusions. Every condescending remark, every patronizing piece of advice, and every cruel laugh only fueled the cold mechanical anticipation building inside my chest. They were happily gorging themselves on a feast of lies. I took another sip of my sparkling water, my eyes tracking each of them patiently, waiting for the main course to be served. The main course arrived in a choreographed display of culinary extravagance. The waitstaff moved with silent precision, placing plates of perfectly seared Wagyu beef butter, poached lobster, and white truffle risotto in front of my family. Harrison immediately ordered another bottle of imported vintage champagne, waving his hand with the careless authority of a man who believed his bank accounts were overflowing. He raised his glass yet again, loudly toasting to his own brilliance, to the anonymous conglomerate that was supposedly saving his legacy, and to Brendan, whom he praised as a true visionary. Brendan soaked up the adulation. He swirled his wine, cutting into his steak with a smug satisfaction, occasionally shooting me a patronizing glance to ensure I was adequately absorbing my own humiliation. Caroline picked at her lobster, complaining about the lighting in the room, while simultaneously bragging to Diane about a new designer handbag she planned to purchase the following morning. Mitchell was drinking heavily. I watched his hands shake slightly every time he lifted his glass. He was desperately trying to match Harrison's energy, overcompensating with loud laughter and exaggerated stories about his stock portfolio, entirely terrified that someone might see through his crumbling facade. I ate my modest salad in silence. I did not touch the champagne. I remained a quiet, observing presence at the far end of the table. To them, my silence was proof of my submission. They believed they had successfully beaten me back down into my place. They thought I was sitting there paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their wealth and success, completely overwhelmed by the presence of my wealthy ex-husband and my powerful father. In reality, I was calculating the exact moment to drop the guillotine. The feast stretched on for nearly 2 hours. When the plates were finally cleared and the decadent desserts had been consumed, the atmosphere in the private dining room shifted. The head waiter approached the table with a sleek black leather folder. He placed it discreetly near the center of the table, right between Harrison and Brendan. I knew exactly what was inside that folder. I had seen the menu prices. I knew the exorbitant cost of the vintage champagne they had been guzzling like water. The total was easily going to be equivalent to a down payment on a standard car. Harrison patted his chest pocket, putting on a theatrical display of reaching for his wallet. He loudly insisted that he would cover the celebration, proclaiming that money was absolutely no object for him tonight. Brendan immediately held up his hand, playing the role of the generous executive. He offered to split the bill, claiming his recent corporate bonuses more than covered a simple family dinner. It was a pathetic alpha male contest between two men who were secretly drowning in massive financial crimes and catastrophic debt. Before either of them could actually pull out a credit card, Mitchell snatched the black leather folder from the center of the table. He flipped it open. His bloodshot eyes widened slightly as he registered the final amount. It was exactly $4,500. Mitchell looked at the staggering number, then looked across the table at me. A cruel, vicious idea formed in his desperate mind. He needed a distraction. He needed to assert dominance over someone to make himself feel powerful while his own house was being auctioned off by the county. Mitchell let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He casually tossed the leather folder directly across the table. It slid across the pristine white linen and landed squarely in my lap. "You are paying tonight," Sis Mitchell announced, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet dining room. "Consider it a thank you fee for Caroline getting you that janitor job. I am sure you can put it on whatever high-interest credit card you use to buy your groceries." The entire table erupted. It was a synchronized chorus of cruelty. Caroline threw her head back and shrieked with laughter, clapping her hands together as if Mitchell had just delivered the greatest punchline in history. Diane chuckled softly, covering her mouth with her napkin, her eyes gleaming with absolute malicious delight. Harrison let out a booming laugh, slapping the mahogany table. He told Mitchell that was a brilliant idea, suggesting that learning financial responsibility by paying for successful people might finally teach me the value of a dollar. Brendan leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. He was savoring what he believed was my ultimate destruction. He expected me to panic. He expected me to look at the $4,500 total and burst into tears. He wanted to watch me beg for mercy to humiliate myself by admitting I did not have the funds to cover even a fraction of their lavish feast. Jamal was the only person who did not laugh. He sat perfectly still, his eyes locked on my face, waiting for the execution to begin. I looked down at the leather folder resting on my lap. I read the itemized receipt, $4,500. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with Brendan. I did not utter a single word of protest or defense. The time for allowing them to control the narrative was officially over. I slowly reached down and picked up my structured leather briefcase. I placed it on my lap. I unclasped the brass locks with a sharp, decisive click that cut through the dying laughter in the room. I reached inside, bypassing the heavy legal binders containing their absolute ruin, and pulled out my wallet. I extracted a single card. I held it between my index and middle fingers. I raised my hand and deliberately dropped the card directly onto the center of the polished mahogany table, right on top of the black leather folder. It did not flutter down like a standard piece of plastic. It hit the solid wood with a heavy, distinct metallic clack. It was an American Express Black Centurion card. It was forged from solid anodized titanium. It was completely black, devoid of flashy numbers or bright logos, carrying only my name etched cleanly into the metal. It was an invitation-only financial instrument reserved strictly for the absolute highest echelon of global wealth. You could not apply for it. You had to spend and pay off millions of dollars annually just to be considered for an invitation, and the initiation fee alone cost more than most people made in a year. The sound of that heavy titanium card hitting the table acted like a gunshot. The cruel laughter died instantly. The silence that slammed into the private dining room was absolute and suffocating. The air was suddenly sucked entirely out of the space. Brendan stared at the black metal card. The smug, triumphant smirk vanished from his face as if it had been physically wiped away. All the color drained rapidly from his cheeks, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. As a high-level corporate strategy director, he knew exactly what that card was. He knew precisely the level of staggering, unimaginable wealth required to possess one. He looked from the card up to my face, his eyes wide with a sudden creeping terror. Harrison stopped breathing. His hand froze halfway to his Scotch glass. His eyes bugged out of his head, locked entirely on the titanium card resting on top of the bill. His arrogant business mind was aggressively calculating the impossible mathematics of the situation. The daughter he had just mocked for living on welfare was casually dropping an unlimited financial instrument onto a $4,500 dinner bill without blinking. The narrative he had built over the past 6 years violently short-circuited in his brain. Mitchell stared at the table, completely paralyzed, the alcohol buzz immediately sobering into stark panic. Caroline looked confused, not fully grasping the financial gravity of the metal card, but sensing the immediate terrifying shift in the room's power dynamic. Diane looked at the titanium card, then looked at me. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She tried to speak, but her throat constricted. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white, her entire reality shattering in real time. "Where did you get that?" Diane stammered, her voice shaking with a pathetic, desperate confusion. She was trembling. "How do you have that card?" I did not answer her. I looked at the terrified faces surrounding me, savoring the absolute destruction of their false superiority. I reached for my sparkling water, took a slow, calm sip, and smiled. The appetizer was finished. It was time for the main course. Right on cue, the velvet curtains at the entrance of the private dining room swept aside. 2 sharply dressed corporate lawyers stepped into the room. They wore immaculate charcoal gray suits that mirrored my own. They did not look like men here to negotiate or make pleasant conversation. They moved with the cold, mechanical precision of executioners. The maitre d' hovered behind them, terrified to intervene. The lawyers ignored him. They walked directly to my end of the table, their expensive leather shoes silent on the plush carpet. Without uttering a single word, they opened their briefcases simultaneously. They pulled out 3 thick leather binders and placed them directly in front of me on the polished mahogany table. The dull thud of the binders hitting the wood echoed in the dead silent room. Everyone at the table was paralyzed. The sheer presence of these men, combined with the heavy titanium credit card still resting on the $4,500 dinner bill, created an atmosphere of absolute dread. Brendan shrank back into his chair, his eyes darting frantically between the lawyers and the binders. He knew exactly what aggressive legal maneuvers looked like. Diane instinctively reached for Harrison, her diamond rings clinking against his watch. Mitchell stared at the binders as if they were live explosives. Caroline looked bewildered, clutching her designer bag against her chest. Jamal just watched me, an expression of profound professional respect settling onto his face. He knew the hammer was coming down. The lead attorney, Jonathan, handed me a sleek silver pen. He gave me a brief nod and stepped back, folding his hands behind his back. The stage was set. The audience was captive. The execution was ready to commence. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I smoothed the lapels of my custom-tailored jacket. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the crystal chandeliers. I looked down at my father. Harrison was sweating. The arrogant patriarch who had spent the entire evening boasting about his brilliant business acumen was currently trembling under the weight of his impending destruction. He tried to speak, but his voice completely failed him. He just stared up at me, his face pale and slick with panic. I picked up the first heavy leather binder. I held it in my hands for a brief moment, letting the sheer gravity of the document fill the room. Then I looked directly into his terrified eyes. I kept my voice perfectly level, devoid of anger or malice. I told him since we were gathered here tonight to celebrate his multi-million-dollar buyout, it was only appropriate that we take a close look at the paperwork. I slid the thick leather binder forcefully across the long mahogany table. It glided over the pristine white linen tablecloth and slammed into Harrison's empty crystal wine glass. The glass tipped over, spilling a few remaining drops of vintage champagne onto the cover of the binder. Harrison flinched violently. He looked down at the binder as if it were a venomous snake. I told him to open it. He hesitated, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the leather cover. Diane tried to lean in to look, her face contorted with pathetic curiosity. Harrison flipped open the cover. His eyes fell upon the bold, aggressive letterhead of 6 words holdings. He read the first paragraph. His jaw dropped open. His breathing became shallow and rapid. I did not give him a single second to process the terminology. I stepped into the breach and delivered the truth he had been desperately trying to avoid for years. I told him that 6 words holdings did not buy his corporate debt to save him. I watched his face as the reality of my words tore through his delusions. I explained my private equity firm acquired his entire commercial loan portfolio for absolute pennies on the dollar. We did not purchase his liabilities to act as a benevolent investor. We bought it to foreclose. I recited the exact financial statistics from memory. I told him he had officially defaulted on 14 consecutive payments. I pointed out he had illegally continued to expense his country club memberships and luxury car leases to a company that was functionally insolvent. I listed the exact dollar amount of the secondary and tertiary loans he had taken out against depreciating warehouse assets. Harrison tried to gasp for air. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning pure white. I did not pause. I delivered the final fatal sentence with surgical precision. I informed him that as of 5 o'clock, his company assets had been seized. The regional bank no longer owned his debt. I owned it. I owned his warehouses, his delivery fleet, and his massive executive office building. I looked down at the man who had locked me out in the freezing rain when I had absolutely nothing. I told him he was completely bankrupt. Harrison let out a strangled, agonizing wheeze. He released his grip on the table and suddenly clutched his chest in sheer terror. His face turned an alarming shade of gray as the magnitude of his financial ruin crushed his lungs. Diane screamed, grabbing his shoulders, completely hysterical. She yelled for someone to call for medical help, but nobody moved. Brendan was frozen in shock, terrified that any sudden movement would draw my attention to him. Mitchell was staring blindly at his empty plate, hyperventilating. Caroline covered her mouth, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. Jamal sat perfectly still, observing the collapse of a man who had built his entire identity on false superiority. I stood at the end of the table watching the chaos unfold. My pulse was entirely steady. I did not feel a single drop of pity for the man gasping for air in his suit. He had built his own prison brick by arrogant brick. I just locked the heavy door. The private dining room descended into absolute chaos. Harrison was gasping for breath, his hands clutching his chest, while Diane frantically rubbed his shoulders, trying to soothe a panic attack that was entirely self-inflicted. The illusion of their untouchable empire had been completely shattered in less than 3 minutes. But the execution was not over. I still had 2 more heavy leather binders sitting on the polished mahogany table. Mitchell suddenly slammed his fist down on the pristine white tablecloth. The expensive silverware rattled loudly against the crystal glasses. He jumped up from his chair, his face flushed with a mixture of expensive bourbon and sudden desperate rage. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. He yelled that I was a complete psychopath. He demanded that I leave the restaurant immediately. He puffed out his chest, attempting to play the role of the fiercely protective, dominant older brother. He told me I had no right to attack our father and that he would personally hire the best corporate lawyers in the city to crush my fraudulent private equity firm into dust. I looked up at my golden boy brother. He was standing there in his custom-tailored designer suit, wearing a luxury watch he bought on a maxed-out credit card, threatening me with vast amounts of money he absolutely did not possess. I felt a profound sense of pity for his overwhelming delusion. He was trying to act like a billionaire savior while actively hiding a catastrophic financial secret that was eating him alive from the inside out. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his aggressive, frantic energy. I simply reached forward and placed my hand firmly on the second heavy leather binder. I looked at him with an expression of complete and utter boredom. I slid the second binder across the long table. It moved with the exact same heavy lethal glide as the first one. It stopped right in front of Mitchell, knocking into his half-empty glass of bourbon and spilling amber liquid onto the white linen. I told him to sit down. My voice was exceedingly quiet, but it carried a cold authority that made the entire room freeze in place. Mitchell glared at me, his chest heaving with exertion. He refused to sit. He refused to touch the black leather binder. He genuinely thought, if he ignored the physical evidence sitting in front of him, he could somehow magically change the reality of his dire situation. I did not wait for his permission. I opened my mouth and methodically stripped away the very last shred of his manufactured dignity. "Sit down, Mitchell," I commanded again. "This is the deed to your house. You secretly lost it to the bank 3 months ago. My firm bought the property. You have exactly 30 days to vacate my house." The words struck him with the physical force of a sledgehammer. His legs completely gave out beneath him. Mitchell collapsed back into his dining chair so heavily the wooden frame groaned under his weight. All the aggressive, protective rage instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. His mouth hung open. He stared at the leather binder as if it contained his own death warrant. Diane stopped rubbing Harrison's shoulders and spun around to face her favorite son. She looked completely bewildered. She asked Mitchell what I was talking about. She demanded that he tell me I was lying. She reminded him loudly that his beautiful 4-bedroom house was fully paid for and that Harrison had generously helped him secure the perfect mortgage years ago. She begged her golden boy to say something to prove my accusations were just another vindictive, jealous lie. Mitchell could not speak. His hands trembled violently as he reached out and slowly opened the leather cover of the binder. He saw the official county auction seals. He saw the finalized foreclosure documents. He saw the undeniable, legally binding transfer of his residential deed directly into the hands of Six Words Holdings. The bank had taken absolutely everything and they had sold it directly to me. The flawless facade of the perfect son completely disintegrated in front of my eyes. Mitchell dropped his head into his hands and began to weep. It was not a dignified, quiet cry. It was the loud, pathetic body-racking sobbing of a man who had entirely destroyed his own life through sheer greed. Between desperate gasps for air, the brutal truth finally spilled out of his mouth. He confessed everything to the silent dining room. He admitted to Diane and Harrison that he had taken out a massive secret second mortgage on the house. He confessed that he had dumped every single penny of that home equity into highly volatile cryptocurrency markets because he wanted to get rich quick without actually working a real job. He cried so hard he could barely form the words as he admitted that the digital market had violently crashed and he had lost absolutely everything in a matter of hours. He told his horrified parents that he had been intercepting the foreclosure notices for months, frantically shredding the certified mail before anyone could see it, terrified of losing his status as the successful heir apparent. He confessed that he was entirely broke, hopelessly in debt, and now he was officially homeless. The revelation hit Diane like a physical blow to the stomach. Her perfect, successful son was a complete fraud. Her wealthy, powerful husband was entirely bankrupt. The two solid pillars of her superficial existence had collapsed into dust within the span of 10 minutes. She could not process the absolute destruction of her reality. Her mind desperately needed a target to blame for the agonizing humiliation she was experiencing. Diane turned her gaze toward me. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a burning, irrational hatred. She lunged forward, slamming both her hands onto the mahogany table. She screamed at me at the top of her lungs. She called me a monster. She shrieked that I was a cold, calculating sociopath who had orchestrated this entire dinner just to torture my own family. She accused me of plotting in the shadows for years, just to tear down everything they had worked so hard to build. She pointed a shaking finger at my face and yelled that no normal human being would ever buy their own brother's foreclosed home just to maliciously kick him onto the street. She demanded to know how I could sit there in my expensive suit, drinking sparkling water while I actively destroyed the people who gave me life. I watched her scream until her voice grew completely hoarse. I watched the veins bulge in her neck as she defended a gambler and a failing businessman. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I felt perfectly, beautifully serene. I looked at my mother and delivered the unvarnished truth. I told her I was not a monster. I was simply an auditor. I explained that I did not create their massive debts. I did not force Harrison to mismanage his supply chain company, and I certainly did not force Mitchell to gamble his home away on digital coins. They had destroyed their own lives through spectacular arrogance and supreme incompetence. I simply possessed the capital and the intellect to capitalize on their profound failures. I reminded Diane of the freezing night I stood on her porch with Liam, Noah, and Stella. I reminded her of the freezing rain soaking through my children's thin clothes. I reminded her that she had looked at my desperate, weeping face and told me I was being overly dramatic. She had protected the Golden Boy's vintage golf clubs while her own grandchildren were forced to sleep in a rusted Honda in a Walmart parking lot. I leaned across the mahogany table, my eyes locking onto hers with a chilling, absolute intensity. I told her that she taught me exactly how to treat family that night. She taught me that survival requires absolute ruthlessness. She taught me that sympathy is a fatal weakness. I was simply returning the exact same energy she had given me, multiplied by a factor of several $1,000,000. I told her to look at Mitchell sobbing into his hands and then look back at me. I told her the Golden Boy was about to find out exactly how cold the streets of Seattle could be, and I would not lose a single second of sleep over his eviction. The silence that followed my declaration to my mother was immediately shattered by a piercing, frantic shriek. Caroline slammed her manicured hands onto the table, knocking over her half-empty water glass. She could not comprehend the shifting power dynamic. Her entire identity was built on being the beautiful, wealthy, favored child who always looked down on her pathetic older sister. Seeing me orchestrate the complete financial annihilation of the family patriarch and the Golden Boy shattered her fragile ego into a million jagged pieces. She pointed her shaking finger at me, her face contorting into an ugly, desperate mask of pure rage. She screamed that I was a complete sociopath. She accused me of being sick in the head, claiming that I was obsessively jealous of her perfect life and her perfect marriage. She yelled that I was trying to destroy everyone else because I could not keep a man bringing up my rusted Honda and the garbage bags I had carried years ago. She shrieked that no amount of money or private equity power would ever make me anything more than the bitter, dumped housewife I truly was. Caroline desperately looked around the room for validation, seeking an ally to back up her hysterical narrative. She turned to Jamal, violently tugging on the sleeve of his tailored suit. She ordered him to put me in my place. She demanded that Jamal use his high-level financial connections to sue my firm, to bankrupt me in return, and to prove to everyone in the restaurant that she and Jamal were the true elite power couple of the family. She was banking on her husband's wealth and status to shield her from the radioactive fallout of Harrison and Mitchell's impending ruin. Jamal did not flinch. He did not rush to comfort his shrieking wife. He calmly reached over and gently, deliberately removed Caroline's frantic hand from his jacket sleeve. He stood up from his chair with the slow, measured grace of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The room held its breath once more. Caroline looked up at him, her eyes wide with desperate expectation, waiting for her knight in shining armor to verbally obliterate me. But Jamal did not look at Caroline. He turned his body completely away from her. He looked directly across the length of the mahogany table right into my eyes. And for the first time all evening, I saw an expression of profound, unadulterated respect on the face of a man sitting at that table. Jamal adjusted his tie, perfectly calm amid the wreckage of the family. He told me that, as a senior risk analyst, his entire career was dedicated to identifying toxic assets and executing swift, efficient evacuations before the ship went down. He said he had reviewed the commercial acquisition logs at his firm 2 weeks ago. He admitted he had traced the aggressive debt purchases of Six Words Holdings right back to my name. He stood there in front of the devastated family and openly praised the absolute brilliance of my strategy. He called it a flawless, perfectly executed hostile takeover. He told me that the way I had silently weaponized my father's arrogance and my brother's greed against them was nothing short of a financial masterclass. He admired how I had stripped the emotion from the equation and operated with sheer terrifying logic. Caroline stared at her husband in sheer uncomprehending terror. Her brain could not process what was happening. She shrieked his name, asking him what he was doing and why he was complimenting the sociopath who was trying to ruin them. She demanded that he stop talking and defend her honor. Jamal slowly turned his head to look down at Caroline. The look of disgust on his face was chilling. He told her she did not have any honor left to defend. He systematically dismantled her illusion of wealth in front of the entire room. He stated clearly that he was entirely exhausted by her endless vanity. He exposed the fact that she had been aggressively draining his personal savings for years just to buy designer handbags and maintain a completely fabricated aesthetic of superiority. He told her that her entire personality was a hollow, expensive lie built on the backs of people she deemed inferior. Jamal reached for his left hand. With a smooth, deliberate motion, he slid his heavy gold wedding band off his ring finger. Caroline gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as she realized what was happening. Jamal held the ring directly over her crystal champagne flute. "I am done funding your delusions, Caroline," he announced, his voice carrying the finality of a judge bringing down a gavel. "I have known about the bankruptcy for weeks. I filed for divorce this morning." He opened his fingers. The heavy gold ring dropped, hitting the expensive vintage champagne with a sharp plink, sinking straight to the bottom of the glass. He informed her the paperwork was already waiting for her at their apartment and that his accounts were permanently locked. Caroline let out a guttural, hyperventilating scream. She clutched her chest, completely breaking down into a hysterical fit of sobbing. She realized in that exact moment that she was losing her husband, her primary source of income, and her entire social status all at once. The golden daughter was suddenly just as destitute and broken as the rest of them. Jamal did not spare her a second glance. He picked up his designer leather briefcase and walked around the massive circular table toward me. He stopped right next to my chair. He extended his hand. I stood up, meeting his gaze, and shook it firmly. It was the handshake of two professionals who recognized game. "Brilliant portfolio, Madam CEO Jamal," said, a genuine smile finally breaking across his face. "A pleasure doing business." He released my hand, turned on his heel, and strode out of the private dining room without ever looking back. He walked through the velvet curtains and disappeared into the restaurant, leaving Caroline screaming hysterically behind him. Her wails echoed off the crystal chandeliers, joining the chorus of Mitchell's pathetic sobbing and Harrison's ragged breathing. The family that had prided itself on being elite, untouchable, and superior was now a complete and total catastrophic ruin. The destruction was comprehensive, but the night was still not over. There was one person left at the table who thought he might still negotiate his way out of the slaughterhouse. Brendan had watched the entire family disintegrate around him. He saw Harrison clutching his chest, Mitchell sobbing into the tablecloth, and Caroline wailing over her ruined marriage. But Brendan was a classic narcissist. In his mind, he was entirely immune to the destruction. He believed he was completely insulated by the legal settlement we signed 3 years ago. He thought the $500,000 he wired to my account was an impenetrable shield. He assumed he had successfully purchased my permanent silence. He stood up from his chair, smoothing the lapels of his custom suit. He puffed out his chest and adopted the smooth, placating tone he used to manipulate corporate clients. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, offering me a condescending, charming smile. He actually thought he could charm the apex predator who had just devoured her own family. "Naomi, let us be reasonable. We have history." Brendan said, his voice dripping with false empathy. He stepped slightly away from Harrison, actively distancing himself from the bankrupt patriarch. "You made your point tonight. You showed everyone how powerful you are. I respect that. I really do. You proved you are not the woman I left behind. But there is no need to direct this hostility at me. We settled our differences like mature adults. I paid you a very generous settlement to ensure we could both move forward peacefully. We have a legally binding non-disclosure agreement. Let us not ruin the progress we have made." He took another step toward me, lowering his voice as if we were co-conspirators sharing a private joke. He told me that my private equity firm was incredibly impressive. He even suggested that with his corporate strategy connections and my financial capital, we could potentially collaborate on future acquisitions. He was actively trying to network with the woman he had thrown into the freezing rain. His sheer, unadulterated audacity was breathtaking. He genuinely believed that a piece of paper and a $500,000 bribe had completely wiped my memory clean. I did not raise my voice. I did not step away from him. I held my ground and offered him a smile so entirely devoid of warmth that it made the blood drain from his face all over again. I tilted my head, looking at him as if he were a particularly slow child who had failed a basic math test. "Did you think the $500,000 you paid me washed your hands clean?" I asked softly, the words cutting through the chaotic sobbing of my family. Brendan frowned, his confident posture faltering. He opened his mouth to remind me of the legal paperwork, but I did not give him the chance to speak a single syllable. "I signed an NDA regarding our divorce, Brendan." "I never signed an NDA regarding your federal tax fraud." The color completely vanished from his face. His eyes darted around the private dining room, suddenly searching for the exits. The charming corporate executive instantly transformed into a cornered animal. I took a step closer to him, closing the distance. I methodically explained the fatal flaw in his legal strategy. The non-disclosure agreement, drafted by his expensive lawyers, specifically prohibited me from disclosing his hidden assets to his employer or using them in a civil family court proceeding. However, federal law supersedes private civil contracts. An NDA cannot legally prevent a citizen from reporting an active, ongoing felony to federal authorities. His high-priced lawyers had protected him from a divorce scandal, but they could not protect him from the United States government. I tapped the screen of my secure smartphone, illuminating the display. I looked directly into his terrified eyes. "I submitted the unredacted audit to the IRS whistleblower office 6 months ago. Federal agents are waiting in the lobby." I handed them the encrypted routing numbers, the shell company registrations in the Cayman Islands, and the exact coordinates of the vacant lots in Nevada you used for your fake vendor invoices. "The federal agents have spent the last half year quietly building a bulletproof racketeering and embezzlement case against you. Brendan began to hyperventilate. He stumbled backward, knocking his chair to the floor. He stammered that I was bluffing, that I would not risk tearing apart the father of my children. I reminded him coldly that he lost the right to call himself a father the second he locked Liam, Noah, and Stella out in the storm. Right on cue, the atmosphere outside the private dining room shifted. Through the thick velvet curtains, the ambient noise of the upscale restaurant abruptly ceased. Then a harsh, strobing light began to reflect against the rain-slicked windows of the dining room. Brilliant flashes of red and blue pierced the elegant, dim lighting of Le Pristine. The wail of police sirens pierced the night, growing deafeningly loud as multiple federal vehicles surrounded the building. Brendan looked at the flashing red and blue lights hitting the crystal chandeliers. Absolute primal panic consumed him. He realized his entire life of luxury, his corporate status, and his freedom were completely finished. He was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. He did not try to negotiate anymore. He turned and bolted for the exit. Brendan crashed through the heavy velvet curtains, sprinting blindly into the main dining area, desperate to find a back door or a kitchen exit. He knocked over a tray of expensive champagne glasses, sending crystals shattering across the polished floor. He did not make it past the reception desk. As he scrambled toward the glass exit doors, 4 federal agents in tactical gear stepped directly into his path. They did not hesitate. The lead agent grabbed Brendan by the shoulder of his custom-tailored suit, spun him around, and slammed him face first against the maitre d's stand. Brendan screamed, struggling pathetically against the agents. His protests were utterly useless. The agents forcefully pulled his arms behind his back. The distinct, sharp click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed through the silent restaurant. I walked slowly out of the private dining room and stood by the velvet curtains, watching the scene unfold with absolute chilling satisfaction. The agents read him his Miranda rights, their voices loud and authoritative. Brendan looked back at me over his shoulder as they dragged him toward the flashing police cruisers. His face was twisted in absolute terror and devastating humiliation. The wealthy, arrogant executive who had laughed while ruining my life was now weeping as they shoved him into the back of a federal vehicle. I watched the taillights disappear into the Seattle rain. My execution was flawless. I walked back into the private dining room. The velvet curtains fell shut behind me, sealing me inside the chamber of their destruction. The atmosphere shifted from aggressive arrogance to a suffocating dead silence. The devastation of my biological family was a tangible weight hanging in the air. The crystal chandeliers sparkled brilliantly, casting warm light over the remnants of Wagyu beef and spilled champagne, but the people sitting around the mahogany table were completely shattered. I stood at the head of the table and observed the wreckage. My father, Harrison, was no longer the imposing patriarch who commanded respect through financial manipulation. He slouched forward in his chair, his shoulders heaving. Tears streamed down his face, dropping onto his silk tie. The man who spent his life obsessing over his public image was openly weeping. He cried for his seized warehouses and the undeniable reality that his status as a wealthy elite had been obliterated. His arrogant pride was stripped away, leaving a broken old man who realized he possessed nothing. To his left, my older brother Mitchell was completely catatonic. His bloodshot eyes were locked in a 1,000-yard stare, fixated blindly on the heavy leather binder resting in front of him. The golden boy of the family, the son who could do no wrong, was processing the horrifying fact that he was officially homeless. His mind was trapped in a relentless loop of his own failures. He gambled away his future on cryptocurrency, and the sister he mercilessly mocked had purchased his ruin at a discount. He looked like a hollow shell of a man. Across the room, my younger sister Caroline was in the midst of a full-blown panic attack. She hyperventilated loudly, clutching the edge of the table with her manicured hands. Jamal had walked out and taken his pristine financial record, his high-level salary, and his patience with him. Caroline gasped for air as the reality of her impending divorce crushed her lungs. She realized she would no longer be able to drain his bank accounts to fund her designer lifestyle. Her shrieks dissolved into a pathetic, high-pitched wheezing. My mother Diane sat completely frozen between them all. Her eyes darted from Harrison sobbing to Mitchell staring blankly to Caroline gasping for air. The perfect family unit she had painstakingly curated and weaponized against me for 33 years had been annihilated in 20 minutes. She looked up at me, her expression a mix of sheer terror and desperate confusion. She waited for me to break. She waited for me to show a sliver of daughterly compassion, to somehow fix the catastrophic mess I unleashed upon them. I did not offer her a single ounce of comfort. I did not gloat. I did not smile, nor did I raise my voice to mock their misery. True power does not require theatrical gloating. True power is absolute cold and entirely unbothered. I walked calmly back to my chair at the table. The terrified waiter and the maitre d' were hovering nervously near the velvet curtains. I caught the waiter eye and offered a polite nod. I picked up the black leather folder containing the $4,500 dinner bill. My solid titanium American Express Black Centurion card was resting on top of the receipt. I opened the leather folder and took out a sleek silver pen. I reviewed the itemized receipt one last time. I looked at the astronomical charges for the imported champagne they guzzled while toasting to my supposed failure. I placed the titanium card into the payment slot. On the signature line, I did not just sign my name. I wrote down a 100% gratuity. I added exactly $4,500 to the tip line, bringing the total authorized charge to a staggering $9,000. I handed the black leather folder directly to the trembling waiter. I told him he provided excellent service tonight and thanked him for his extreme patience. The waiter looked at the total, his eyes widening in pure shock, and bowed his head in gratitude. I snapped the brass locks of my structured leather briefcase shut. The sharp metallic click snapped my parents back to reality. Diane stood up on trembling legs. Her expensive diamond jewelry caught the light as she reached a shaking hand out toward me across the long table. She opened her mouth, desperate to beg, desperate to use her maternal authority one last time to command me to save them from the wreckage. I did not let her speak a single word. I picked up my briefcase and looked directly into her tear-filled eyes. I let my gaze sweep over Harrison, Mitchell, and Caroline. I looked at the people who made it their life mission to make me feel small, worthless, and entirely dependent. You closed the door on me and my children when we had nothing, I said. My voice was perfectly steady, echoing clearly over the sound of their pathetic sobbing. I just closed the door on your entire lives. I did not wait to see their reactions. I turned my back on my biological family for the absolute last time. I walked through the heavy velvet curtains, exiting the private dining room with the calm, measured pace of a woman entirely at peace. I crossed the main dining floor of Le Pristine, ignoring the curious stares of the wealthy patrons who witnessed the federal arrest of my ex-husband just moments prior. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the restaurant and stepped out into the crisp, freezing Seattle night. The rain was still falling, washing the city streets clean. The cold air hit my face, but I did not shiver. I felt a profound, beautiful warmth spreading through my chest. I walked down the wet pavement toward my waiting car, completely untouched by their misery. The next 3 weeks moved with the relentless, brutal efficiency of a perfectly balanced spreadsheet. I did not lift a single finger to accelerate their destruction. I simply let the absolute mechanisms of finance and federal law run their natural, devastating course. Harrison's supply chain company was officially liquidated in record time. The bankruptcy court seized the warehouses, the outdated delivery fleets, and the massive executive building he had proudly paraded as his empire. My private equity firm, Six Words Holdings, smoothly absorbed the highly valuable commercial real estate and systematically sold off his rotting assets for scrap. The Mercer Island estate was immediately repossessed by the primary mortgage lenders. Harrison lost his country club memberships, his luxury car leases, and his entire identity in less than 14 days. Diane was violently stripped of her superficial armor. To secure a basic living situation, she was forced to visit pawn shops across the city. She sold her diamond necklaces, her vintage watches, and her imported designer handbags just to scrape together enough cash for a security deposit. She and Harrison moved into a cramped, depressing two-bedroom apartment in a decaying industrial neighborhood. The walls were paper thin, the heating barely functioned, and the kitchen was practically non-existent. Mitchell, officially evicted from his house by my legal team, had absolutely nowhere else to go. The former Golden Boy was forced to drag his few remaining suitcases into that tiny, miserable apartment with our parents. They were three deeply arrogant, highly toxic people, trapped in less than 900 square feet. They spent their days breathing in the suffocating reality of their poverty, screaming at each other over utility bills and the cost of cheap groceries. Caroline experienced an equally brutal descent. Jamal was absolutely ruthless in the divorce proceedings. Because she had been aggressively draining his personal accounts to fund her delusions, his high-powered legal team successfully froze her access to his assets entirely. Without Jamal's massive corporate salary to shield her, Caroline was left absolutely destitute. The former family princess who had loudly mocked my custom-tailored power suit was forcefully introduced to minimum wage reality. I heard through the local financial grapevine that she had no choice but to take a job as a retail cashier at a discount clothing boutique. She was forced to stand on her feet for 8 agonizing hours a day, ringing up the exact kind of cheap garments she used to mercilessly mock, wearing a plastic name tag and a forced retail smile. As for Brendan, his fall was the steepest and the most satisfying. The IRS whistleblower office and the FBI did not offer polite plea deals to men who stole millions in corporate embezzlement. A federal grand jury quickly indicted him on 14 separate counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and corporate racketeering. The 22-year-old intern abandoned him the very moment his bank accounts were frozen. Brendan was currently sitting in a cold concrete federal holding facility, facing a mandatory minimum of 10 years in federal prison. His expensive corporate lawyers dropped him the second his retainer bounced. He had traded his beautiful family for an orange jumpsuit. With her fake empire reduced to absolute ashes, Diane's toxic delusion morphed into sheer, unadulterated desperation. She finally realized that her despised, abandoned middle daughter was the only legitimate multi-millionaire in the family. She somehow managed to hire a cheap private investigator with her last few pawnshop dollars to track down my residential address. It was a Tuesday evening. The Seattle rain was pouring down in heavy freezing sheets, perfectly mirroring the exact weather of the night she locked my children and me out in the cold. I was sitting in the massive vaulted living room of my heavily guarded mega mansion. I was sipping warm herbal tea, reviewing highly profitable quarterly reports on my tablet, while a massive stone fireplace warmed the entire room. Suddenly, my perimeter security system chimed softly. The high-definition camera feed automatically flickered onto the main screen of my smart home control panel. Standing outside the towering 10-foot wrought iron security gates of my estate was my mother. Diane was completely soaked to the bone. Her cheap, waterlogged coat was plastered to her shivering frame. Her hair, usually so perfectly coiffed and highlighted, hung in wet, pathetic clumps across her tear-stained face. She was frantically smashing her palm against the glowing intercom button, desperate for a response. I watched her on the glowing screen for a long moment. I set my tablet down on the coffee table. I walked over to the security console and pressed the audio connection, letting the crisp, clear microphone carry my voice directly out to the street. I asked her what she was doing trespassing on my private property. Hearing my voice broadcast through the speakers, Diane completely broke down. She wept into the intercom, the sound of her frantic sobbing crackling with static and heavy rain. She violently shook the heavy iron bars of the gate. She begged me to press the button to let her inside. She cried that the cramped apartment was driving her absolutely insane, that Harrison was deeply depressed and refusing to get out of bed, and that Mitchell was entirely useless and eating their remaining food. She pleaded for my forgiveness, wailing that she had made a terrible, terrible mistake. She attempted to deploy the ultimate toxic manipulation tactic she had relied on her entire life to control her children. She screamed through the freezing rain that we were blood. She cried that family was supposed to stick together during the hardest times. She sobbed that I was her daughter, and I had a moral obligation to save my own mother from the horrific consequences of her financial ruin. She begged her successful billionaire daughter to open the gates and rescue her from the misery she had entirely brought upon herself. I did not press the button on the intercom to grant her access. I did not speak another word through the electronic speaker. I simply disconnected the audio feed and stepped away from the console. I walked to the heavy oak front door of my mansion and pulled a large black umbrella from the brass stand. I stepped out into the freezing Seattle night. The rain drummed heavily against the fabric of the umbrella as I began the long, deliberate walk down my manicured driveway. I moved with the slow, measured pace of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to fear. As I approached the towering wrought iron security gates, the glow of the estate perimeter lights illuminated the scene perfectly. My mother stood on the outside of the heavy metal bars. Her hands gripped the cold iron so tightly her knuckles were white. Her cheap-soaked coat clung to her shivering frame. The rain washed away whatever makeup she had managed to scrape together, revealing the deep, exhausted lines of a woman completely broken by her own spectacular arrogance. She looked exactly the way I had looked 6 years ago. The symmetry of the universe was brutally perfect. Diane saw me approaching, and her desperate sobbing intensified. She pressed her face against the wet iron bars, her eyes wide with frantic, pathetic hope. She thought my presence meant I was ready to surrender. She actually believed her theatrical tears had successfully manipulated my emotions. "Please, Naomi," Diane begged, her voice cracking over the sound of the pouring rain. "Please open the gate. You have to help us. We have absolutely nothing left. The apartment is freezing and your father can barely get out of bed. We are family. We need you." I stopped walking. I stood exactly 3 feet away from the heavy iron gate, keeping myself perfectly dry under the shelter of my umbrella. I looked at her shivering in the storm, and I audited her soul. I searched for a single ounce of genuine remorse, a sliver of regret for the abuse she had inflicted upon me for 33 years. I found absolutely nothing but pure, unadulterated financial desperation. She did not miss her daughter. She missed her bank account. My voice was pure ice when I finally spoke. "Do you remember the night you let your 3 grandchildren sleep in a car in the freezing rain?" I asked softly. The question struck her like a physical blow. Her frantic sobbing hitched in her throat. Her eyes darted away, unable to maintain contact with my cold, unwavering stare. She opened her mouth to make an excuse to deploy another pathetic gaslighting tactic about how she thought I was just being dramatic, but I did not let her speak a single syllable. I leaned slightly closer to the iron bars, ensuring she heard every single word over the crashing storm. "You aren't family, Diane," I stated with absolute terrifying clarity. "You're just a woman with whom I unfortunately share DNA." I watched the last remaining spark of hope completely extinguish in her eyes. The horrific realization finally crashed over her. She realized that the daughter she had gleefully discarded had evolved into an untouchable force of nature. She realized that no amount of tears, begging, or familial guilt would ever unlock this gate. Her total financial and social annihilation was completely permanent. I did not wait for her to formulate a response. I did not offer her a single piece of advice. I simply turned my back on her. I walked away from the heavy wrought iron gates and headed back up the long, sweeping driveway. With every step I took toward my brilliantly lit home, I felt the residual weight of 33 years of toxic expectations entirely evaporate. I was completely free. The cold night air felt profoundly refreshing. I did not look over my shoulder. I left her standing in the freezing downpour, trapped on the wrong side of the impenetrable fortress I had built with my own 2 hands. I reached the massive front doors and stepped inside the grand foyer. I closed the heavy door behind me, instantly shutting out the sound of the raging storm and the pathetic wailing of the woman outside. The air inside my home was incredibly warm, scented with the rich smell of burning cedar from the living room fireplace. I walked into the massive family room. The fire crackled brightly, casting a beautiful golden glow over the space. Sitting on the plush rug were my 3 children. Liam, Noah, and Stella were laughing hysterically, completely safe, entirely oblivious to the miserable ghost standing outside in the rain. Sitting on the floor right beside them, helping Stella build a towering castle out of wooden blocks, was my new fiancé. He was a brilliant, successful pediatric surgeon. He was a man who possessed immense intellect and an incredibly kind heart. He looked up when I entered the room, his eyes crinkling at the corners with genuine, unconditional love. He did not feel threatened by my power or my massive wealth. He celebrated my strength. He was an actual partner, a man who built a foundation of absolute security and respect for both me and my children. He smiled and asked if everything was all right outside. I looked at my healthy, thriving children. I looked at the man who loved us flawlessly. I felt the profound, unshakable peace of a woman who had successfully burned away the rot of her past to forge a beautiful, unbreakable future. I smiled back at him, walked over to the roaring fireplace, and sat down on the rug surrounded by my true family. I told him everything was absolutely perfect. At that exact moment, the automated security system chimed softly through the house. The heavy iron gates at the end of the driveway clicked shut, locking the mechanism with a deep, resonant thud. The perimeter was entirely sealed. The toxicity was locked out forever. Sometimes the trash takes itself out. Have you ever had to close the door on toxic family? Let me know in the comments. The harrowing journey of Naomi serves as a profound testament to a harsh but necessary truth: shared DNA does not automatically make someone family. From the very beginning of her ordeal, Naomi faced unimaginable betrayal, not just from a cheating spouse, but from the very people society dictates should be her ultimate safety net. Her parents and siblings chose superficial appearances, financial greed, and their own fragile egos over the basic survival of a mother and her 3 freezing children. They weaponized her vulnerability, treating her as a disposable liability rather than a daughter or sister in need. The greatest lesson here is the immense transformative power of establishing absolute boundaries. Society often pressures us to forgive and forget when it comes to blood relatives, pushing the toxic narrative that family is forever regardless of the emotional abuse inflicted. However, Naomi's triumphant rise from the ashes proves that true strength lies in walking away from environments specifically designed to break you. By severing ties with her abusers and redirecting her energy into her own potential, she did not just survive, she built an impenetrable empire. She redefined family on her own terms, filling her life with people who offered genuine respect and unconditional love. Her story teaches us that we do not have to accept scraps of affection or tolerate manipulation just because we share a bloodline. We are never obligated to set ourselves on fire to keep toxic relatives warm. Healing truly begins the moment we recognize our own intrinsic worth and flatly refuse to accept anything less, even if it means leaving our past standing in the freezing rain. Take a moment today to evaluate the relationships in your life and have the courage to permanently close the door on anyone who diminishes your worth.